Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on social enterprise for community legal centres. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are holding this webinar today. In Brisbane, they are the Turrbal and Yagara people. I wish to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders continue to play in our society. As this webinar is being viewed by people across Queensland and Australia, I'd like to also pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land throughout the country and extend a warm welcome to any First Australians listening today. Here's just some housekeeping if you have any issues during the webinar. All right. So this presentation and webinar is for professional development and education purposes for community legal centre staff and is not intended to provide legal advice. It is not to be used for commercial purposes without the express permission of the presenter. Information is current as at 14th of May 2019. Today we are very fortunate to have as our presenter Belinda Luke from the QUT Business School. I'll now hand over to Belinda and talk to you again at the end of the session.
Thanks, Amanda. Hi, everyone. So as Amanda said, I'm based at QUT and I actually work in the School of Accountancy, but within that school we have the Australian Centre for Non-Profit and Philanthropic Studies, and so that is very much focused on third sector organisations, which is my interest in terms of research. And so what I'm talking about today is social enterprises, which is one part of the third sector. So let's have a look. So the objectives of this webinar is basically to promote awareness and understanding of what social enterprise is. It's definitely a prominent topic. It's becoming increasingly of interest for policymakers, government, for practitioners, and for the traditional not-for-profit sector who's looking at challenges and seeing perhaps social enterprise as one way around those challenges. Or highlights what some of the challenges that are faced by social enterprise, because as a different organisation or as a distinct organisation, they also face their own challenges. And then consider how some of those challenges might effectively be addressed. So we kind of talk about social enterprise as in a nascent or developing phase, because while the concept's reasonably well established, in practice and the norms around it and the structures around it are definitely still evolving, and evolving differently in different countries. So what we'll look at is just the background to social enterprise, so a little bit about the history and what it looks like today, what we know and what we don't know. And I think that's really important because there are some things that we generally agree on, but there's a lot that's still yet to be determined about the issue of social enterprise. Question of why social enterprise is, for people who aren't so familiar with it, is it a good option? Is it, an obvious option or a better option? So we look at when social enterprise might be particularly useful. And I'd say it's not an option for everyone or in all cases. So you really need to make sure that, if you're choosing that path, it's appropriate for the purposes and the profile of what you're trying to do. And then the issues that relate to social enterprise. And so I've just picked three which are quite prominent. One is the various legal forms. One is the hybrid nature. And so by hybrid, we mean it's got dual social and financial objectives. And that's really the crux of social enterprise, that it's balancing those two things. And then what comes from that is the reporting in relation to social enterprise. And we'll see that, the reporting often isn't well regulated, and so therefore it's not so well developed. And whenever you have discretion, then of course you have variation. And so that's very much what we see in this space. And last of all, we'll talk about the future of social enterprise. And I do think it's got a really strong future, but I guess it's just about, putting the structures in place to make sure that it's a promising future and that it's something that we really take advantage of in the best way. As Amanda said, there's time for questions at the end, but if you do have them along the way, I'm more than happy to answer them. So background to social enterprise, it's emerges as an important part of the third sector. So we talk about, the private sector is typically for profit, that's their focus. Public sector, government, so it's providing essentially social services. And the third sector is often what the gap that's left. They position it as, well, it's what isn't addressed by the private sector because it's not considered profitable enough or commercially viable, or it's what the government didn't get around to addressing because, of course, they've got limited funds, limited resources, and, different priorities. And so this third sector is obviously gaining more attention, and social enterprise is an important part of that. As we said, so in this case, we'd say social enterprises, they're established for a social or environmental. So when I talk about social, I just mean the broader social aspect, social purpose, but they trade to support their mission. So there's a commercial income stream that's coming in order to support or to finance the social objectives. And so we often hear about terms like profit for purpose or balancing of money and mission. And it's an alternative to that traditional not-for-profit model, because while not-for-profits are important and they've been around for a very long time, they obviously struggle in, securing ongoing finance and with the increasing number of not-for-profits. And we heard that from the Australian Charities and Non-Profits Commissioner the other week, that there's an increasing number of charities being registered, but there's only so much that's donated to those charities. And of course we want to be selective in ensuring that the charities we donate to are using that money appropriately. And so social enterprises will, rather than relying on that source of funding, if I can generate my own funding, it gives me the flexibility, the freedom, and therefore the discretion as to how I spend it. So various organisations in Australia represent social enterprise or are trying to help the sector develop. Two of those are Social Ventures Australia, which works with partners to alleviate disadvantage. And, when we talk about the third sector, it's often, we said it's the gap that's left by the other two sectors. It's what's left behind. And for people with social awareness who think that, well, obviously that deserves attention, that's where their focus and resources are going. And the other organisation is Social Traders, and so that aims to connect social enterprises with social procurement opportunities. And so that's become a really big issue in terms of, all companies, have contracts or require services, but if they can look at where they are going to pay or who they are going to pay for those services, and look at not only the commercial details of the contract, but also are there any social aspects to that contract? Are they contracting with a social enterprise? So they're still getting a commercial service, but they're also getting the associated social benefits. Then that's becoming, a very deliberate decision by a number of companies, government as well as private sector companies. So what Social Traders is trying to do is just to help awareness of the social organisations out there who can deliver commercial services, and also then just scale up the number of companies who choose to make a socially conscious decision in their commercial contract process. And so Social Traders is jointly funded by the Darra Foundation and the Victorian State Government. Okay, if we just take a step back for a moment and ask, well, what's the point of business? I guess over time there's been very different perspectives on what is the point of difference. So in the 1970s, Milton Friedman, for example, we associate that with maximising profit for shareholders. And when we moved on to the 1980s, Peter Drucker, in terms of management, talked about creating a customer. And as we've moved on, and Richard Branson is just one of many, but the focus has gone perhaps at times less to profit and more about a wider perspective. So for example, making a difference in the world. And that has become something that a lot of people, businesses and individuals, are now conscious of. But if we look behind those definitions and we go back to Friedman, for example, they said actually the responsibility of business is to make profits, but while conforming to the basic rules of society, both those embodied by law and those embodied in ethical custom. And so I guess if we look at, the changes in environmental awareness, for example, from the 1970s to today, for social awareness, which there would have been an element of that in 1970s, but it's just a sort of clearly a different shift in emphasis, what we look at today. So it wasn't that the statement ended as profits, but it's profits while still considering those social issues. And it's not strictly just following the law, but looking at what's socially acceptable. And so I think that's important, because so often that sentence is cut in half and we only look at the first part. But actually the context of that sentence then becomes really important. Similarly, in the 1950s, Howard Bowen was talking about managers following the lines of action which are desirable in terms of the objectives and value of society. And so again, I think, fine to associate for-profit or private sector organisations with profit, but if whatever society places emphasis on, I think that also then becomes very important. So it's conscious consumerism. So deliberately making a choice as to the little things, where you buy a coffee from, different commercial transactions that happen for all of us. And Bowen also in 48 talked about the social economy, which is a slightly broader concept than the third sector, because if we look at the social economy, we say, well, actually anyone in the private sector or the public sector can contribute to that social economy. So when you're doing activity that directly has a social benefit or even indirectly has a social benefit, then there's the broader social economy which is benefiting from that. So it kind of just reframes what the point of business is, and acknowledging profit is not the only thing that's going to help business in terms of economics, but also the social aspects of that. If we talk about the business spectrum and we look at it just quite simply from two angles of for-profit organisations versus not-for-profit organisations, here we can see two dichotomies. But if we look at the detail that might go in between that, okay, when we see, well, there's actually a range or a number of organisation types that fit in along that spectrum. So social enterprise, for example, is more or less in the middle here. But on the left of that is not-for-profits with income-generating activity, and we see that a lot now. So organisations, for example, like the Cancer Council, so clearly not-for-profit, but they start to sell different things in order to generate revenue, so an income stream. And on the right-hand side, we see things like socially responsible businesses, so businesses that profile or market themselves as having a clear social awareness and social responsibility. And one further along on the right-hand side is corporations that practice social responsibility. Okay, so now we're edging more to the for-profit, but of course there's a lot of for-profit organisations that promote that social awareness and follow it up with really important action. So if we looked at that from left to right, for example, the not-for-profit organisation would be the charity, the social enterprise, and there's a range of them, but the example we've got here is WISE, which is Work Integrated Social Enterprise. So that, for example, could be a small business where they deliberately take long-term unemployed people, bring them in as employees to help train them up and either employ them long-term or help them transition to another organisation where they can apply those skills to get a full-time job in a separate organisation. Socially responsible business, I guess one that's positioned itself like that is the Body Shop. And even for mining companies, as we move towards the for-profit spectrum, there's a lot of those organisations that have clear social programs within them. So yes, they're predominantly for-profit organisations, but they have some clear social programs. So the spectrum really just shows the emphasis between, are you mission orientated or are you profit orientated? And, there's no right or wrong answer here, because in a broad economy, you need a range of those organisations. But it does help show how social enterprise is almost positioned in the middle. So on the left-hand side, we'd see that they have a mission motive, they have stakeholder accountability, so a broader range of people to whom they feel accountable. And if there is income, it's reinvested in the social programs. Whereas in the right-hand side, it's very much a profit-making motive, and so the focus is on shareholder accountability. You're answerable primarily to your shareholders. And even that's an interesting point, because, if the shareholders have a profit focus, then you'll be responding to that, the accountability for profits. But if your shareholders have a profit and social focus, so depending on their collective emphasis, then you might also be needing to respond to both the social outcomes as well as the profit outcomes. And we see that in socially responsible investments. So it's very much the expectations of shareholders that organisations need to respond to. But definitely, in the current environment, we'd say predominantly that's people, when they're investing in shares, they're expecting returns on that in terms of financial returns. So the profit is then distributed back to the shareholders. When we look at the social enterprise model, there's basically three frames of reference, and this is based on ALTA, studies done in 2004 and 2007. And it's helpful to look at it in this way, but it's also quite important to understand the issues that different social enterprises face. For example, in the left-hand side, the first one here is where they're mission-centric. So the core commercial activity directly overlaps with the social program. And so what we talked about a moment ago, that work-integrated social enterprise, that would be an example of the first image there, because the people they're employing are directly part of the business itself. And so in a sense, it helps streamline things, or it helps keep your focus, because you want to train people, and those people are directly important for the functioning of the business. Okay, the next one along is where there might be some overlap, but there also might be some disconnect. So what you're doing as a business to generate income or to earn revenues has some overlap with the social programs, but there is also a distance, or there's not a complete overlap. And so then there's an awareness or a balance that's needed, because we talk about this issue of mission drift, that if you become too focused on the revenue streams, you'll accidentally forget to give enough attention to the social programs. So in the first case, that is very unlikely. In the second case, it's an issue that needs to be monitored, and that becomes even more exaggerated in the third case. If what you're doing is completely unrelated to your social programs, and you think if we've just got more money here, we can make a bigger social impact, it's almost like chicken and egg. And we talk to organizations and they say, well, we say as social enterprises, there's dual accountability. You're accountable for the social outcomes as well as the financial outcomes. And while they acknowledge that, in practice they say, okay, but if I don't have money, I can't make a social impact. And so that's a very pragmatic, it's a completely reasonable situation. But that just means that sometimes initially the emphasis will be on generating revenues and then turning attention to the social programs. But of course, it's making sure there's not a big gap in those two things. And so that is a tension, or it's something that needs to be monitored. In terms of the development of social enterprise globally, in Australia we don't have any specific structure for social enterprise, so it's quite flexible. And in fact, a lot of organisations that we speak to, if we hold forums on social enterprise, one of the most common things will be asked is, am I a social enterprise? And so there's a little bit of confusion, or just a little bit of uncertainty about, if there is no structure, then how do I know I should identify as that particular organisation? And that is a little bit of a difference within Australia versus other countries. So in other countries, they have started to establish a structure specifically for social enterprise. And for example, in the US, they have what we refer to as L3C, or a low profit limited liability company. They refer to that as having legal and tax flexibility, but most importantly, what they refer to is having the social benefits of a non-profit organisation. And really what they're saying here is, well, you can identify as a social enterprise in the marketplace. So profits aren't your main objective, so they expect that your profits would be modest or relatively low. But matched with that is that you have a clear social objective. And so really the benefit here, what they promote as the benefit, is the market positioning. Because if you can't get awareness of being a social enterprise, which is something some social enterprises struggle with in Australia, well, having a structure would be one way of helping with that. Okay, and that's similarly in the UK, where they have community interest companies. So it's a business, but it has primarily social objectives. And a lot of times when these structures were being established, there was discussion around, well, should it get tax exemption or should it get tax concessions? And in a lot of cases, the answer has actually been no, they're not getting significant tax concessions, but what they are getting is the profile and the marketing of being a social enterprise, so that when other companies want to engage with them or want to engage in a socially responsible way, they understand that that's an option, that those companies have that profile. And similarly in British Columbia and Canada, they have the Community Contribution Company. And so again, it's just recognised as a hybrid organisation in that they have commercial activities, but those profits are then applied for social purposes. There's also a range of certifications that are available, so benefit for corporations in the US. And this is where it starts to get a little less clear, I would say, because here what they're getting is a certification to say, yes, we consider social, environmental and financial implications. But what the difference is that if you're a social enterprise, you're established for a social purpose. So social is predominantly the reason for your establishment, and the financial acts to support that. Whereas now we're starting to move away from that a little bit and just say, look, we have an understanding, or we have a respect for each of these things. But if it's not predominantly social, there's a risk that the social could become very minimal, or the environmental, a dwindling focus. And it's really making sure that those two are dominant rather than just a focus among those three issues. Similarly, they have B corporation certification, which can happen across the world. And that's, again, an organisation is assessed to see if they have a certain amount of social and financial certain amount of social and environmental performance ticks, if you like. But again, we're starting to move away from we were established for a social purpose rather than, we're a business and yes, we respect various social and environmental issues. And so I think this certification, it comes with a cost, an annual fee, but I think it also comes with a risk in that, yes, there's a vetting process, but I don't think the same emphasis is there as to what is associated with social enterprise, that it's primarily for a social purpose and the financial supports that. Okay, if we have a look at social enterprise in Australia, what we know is there's an estimated 20,000 social enterprises. So every few years they do a Finding Australia's Social Enterprise Sector survey that's done by Joe Barraquette and colleagues down at Swinburne University. That 20,000 is an estimate, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But what you can see from their findings is that they're mostly small organisations. So almost 3/4 of the sector in Australia is small, but it's a gradually maturing sector. So in terms of the number of years that it's been operating, so more than 10 or 2 to 5 years, okay, then you see that it's a reasonable balance amongst those three. And they operate in various industries and in various legal forms. So they're across all different industries. In terms of legal form, because we don't have a specific structure in Australia, it could be an incorporated association, companies limited by guarantee, proprietary limited companies, there's a range of options. So while there's flexibility in that sense, there's also a trade-off in terms of a loss of identity, because yes, someone will be aware of their legal form, but they might be confused as to whether they fit the requirement or the definition or the understanding of what a social enterprise is. In terms of beneficiaries, basically, social enterprises, we said, can be established for a range of social or environmental purposes. And in operating in a range of industries, there's a whole bunch of different objectives that they do pursue. But grouped under these three main headings, it was people with disabilities, youth and disadvantaged women. But of course, there's many categories under each of those headings. One of the benefits of this identification as a social enterprise was opportunities for social procurement. So exactly what we were talking about before. If there was a register of social enterprises and you knew you had a contract, you were looking to have certain services provided or certain goods provided, you could go to a for-profit organisation, or if there was a comparable social enterprise that was going to deliver similar service, similar price, but also reimburse those profits back for a social objective, then that might sway decision making. And so this is one of the real issues, is knowing, understanding or appreciating who is a social enterprise, awareness of what they do, so that we then make more informed choices. And so that directly leads to issues in terms of needs of the social enterprise sector, because a lot of the time in the early days, I'd say 5 to 10 years ago, there was a lot of discussion around, we need funding, or we need government support, maybe we need government concessions. But I think the discussion has very much shifted since then, and now it's more discussion about support in the form of policy, okay, and whether that's a single, a specific form for social enterprises, which then gives them recognition and more prominence. Definitely finance, but this is not necessarily from government, but just finance in a broader sense. So, in this sense, they're not so different to not-for-profits in that, companies need funding, or organisations need funding, and it's just knowing that you have a secure income stream, because while there are, as a social enterprise, you have commercial services and so commercial revenue streams, you've got the same challenges of lots of small businesses in just knowing, are they reliable, secure, or long-term revenue streams. And the last one there is impact measurement. And this is a really important issue, I think, particularly coming from an accounting perspective, because if someone wants to tell me they're a social enterprise and they want to convince me that they're doing good things, then I would think the obvious step is to report on that. But that's very much a gap in terms of the social enterprise sector. So there's not a great amount of reporting, and there's certainly not a lot of consistent reporting, which makes comparing organisations really quite challenging. So there's some of the issues that we'll move on to in a moment. Okay, what we don't know about social enterprises. Okay, we talked about what we do know based on the Barraquette et al. Study, but unfortunately what that shows is also what we don't know, because while they estimated 20,000 social enterprises in Australia, that was actually based on a survey where there was only 231 surveys that were, or completed surveys received, and of that only 100 were fully complete. So there was extrapolation in that process based on looking at geographies and the number of organisations they were either aware of or who had responded, and then extrapolating from that. So 20,000 is an estimate, but to be certain, we don't know exactly how many social enterprises are in Australia. And I think that's an important thing that government can help with in one form or another. If there's a specific structure for social enterprises, if there's a specific registration process, that will help build awareness and then inform developments from there. One of the other challenges is there's no single accepted definition of social enterprise. And I guess academics don't help with this. Unfortunately, sometimes we tend to look at each other's work and critique it, but then there's variations even across countries in what they consider social enterprise to be. But there is a general acceptance of, social enterprises are hybrid organisations, which means they're established for a social objective and they trade to support that social objective. And I think, as long as we have some general acceptance of that, then the differences are relatively minor, or the differences can be isolated. But we definitely do have a general understanding of what social enterprise is. Some of the issues that come from around that then are things relating to the financial aspects, because there's questions regarding financial sustainability and funding uncertainty. And this is no different really to any for-profit organisation. You look at a small business and they'd say, I'm having a good year this year, I hope it continues next year. So no one's guaranteed profits from one year to the next. But for social enterprise, they might feel that much more vulnerable if they have a limited customer base, if we're talking about a particular small organisation, if it's a limited income stream. And of course, you talk about funding uncertainty, but then that also goes to financial sustainability, which is long-term. And with that also then comes the issue of financial independence. So if you just have one or two customers and they're great, reliable, long-term customers, but you're very much dependent on them, and you might not be just dependent on them for the finances, but they might also have some social input or some social expectations. So, there's a difference there, or a potential compromise when you're relying on a small number of people and they go beyond just the commercial transaction. So financial sustainability is long-term. Financial security is what people might have in the short term, but there's a whole bunch of variables which might change either for the social enterprise themselves or for the people the organisations they're transacting with, which change that financial security. So it's very much a short-term perspective as well as a long-term perspective. So, challenges for social enterprise. So we've talked about financial sustainability and financial independence. Okay, we also mentioned the idea of mission drift, because if your social business isn't directly integrated with your commercial business, then there's a risk that, and then we see this with organisations where, for example, they might have a great opportunity for a government contract that takes them in one direction, but it also takes their time and energy, which means they've forgotten about their social, or they haven't got enough resources to direct to their social objectives at the moment. So it's just making sure there's a balance between those two things. Financing for social enterprises, and so we said yes, it's commercial, but quite often it's not purely commercial revenue streams. So they might rely on a range of commercial and non-commercial donated funding or whatever other form is available to them. And if we were very strict about the definition of a social enterprise, some people might say, well, it's where more than half of your income is commercial, or it's where your profits are reinvested. Well, what happens if you don't make a profit in any particular year? So I think sometimes those strict definitions aren't helpful, because they're no different to any other business, that profit's not guaranteed. There's variables that change from year to year. But if we go back to the principles of, yes, I'm established for a social purpose and I trade with the intention of using those profits to direct back into my social objectives, I think that's what's really fundamental to the social enterprise. We mentioned legal forms, and I think, while we don't have a separate legal form in Australia, and so therefore identity can be challenging, just establishing yourself, but there is potentially avenues where that can be developed, so there is assistance available, but I don't think that's being well developed at the moment. But I think what they really need is recognition, and I mean they as an industry, so that anyone who's engaging in commercial services can be aware that, of the 5 organisations they might be considering, one is a social enterprise, so that would be an extra consideration in your decision making. And the last one there is measuring or communicating impact. And a lot of the discussion is around measuring. Everyone wants to jump straight into measurement. But as an accountant, I would say that's almost the wrong discussion to have, because the measurement is so subjective, and it has a bunch of errors, a bunch of challenges itself, that I'd step back and say, just start by communicating impact, because the reporting is so variable here. And absolutely, the impact and the change and is important to report, but perhaps as a first stage, communicate it, and then once your communication's developed, then think about measuring it. So I really feel that the discourse at the moment is in the wrong order. First communicate, then consider measuring. And so I'll just spend a little bit of time talking on that, and we won't go into too much detail. But in terms of social reporting frameworks, there are a whole bunch, and these are not just for social enterprises, but they are for for-profit organisations as well as not-for-profit organisations, and for third sector as well, as they're becoming more prominent. So GRI is the Global Reporting Initiative, and they have frameworks where they promote companies who've adopted their framework and applaud them for a 400 or 500 page report. Okay, frankly, that's ridiculous. How many of us are going to read a 400 or 500 page report for one company and then compare it to 3 other companies? That's not digestible. That's not the kind of thing that is, I would say, good reporting principles. The next one, SROI, is social return on investment, and this has been used quite a bit by a range of organisations, third sector in particular, because they want to say, well, for the investment, for the money we put in, here's our social return. But again, there's challenges with that, because then we start to, well, what's the value of happiness from employment? What's the value of financial security? What's the value of being put back into a community and feeling part of that community and contributing to it? And as soon as we start to honestly try and put numbers on those things, it loses integrity. So yes, identify them, because absolutely they're valuable. But the minute you start to put a dollar value, your argument, I think, becomes less convincing. So there's a real risk there. The OECD has put out a framework, which is basically inputs, outputs, outcomes framework. So just to show what you're doing, because a lot of the time it's not even clear what organisations do, but then the impacts from that. Similarly, integrated reporting, and then you can see a range underneath that. And interestingly, quite a few of them have come from accounting standards boards. So the AASB is the Australian Accounting Standards Board. The IPSASB is the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board, and the NZASB is the New Zealand Accounting Standards Board. So I guess the message here is that it's complex, and there's a number of accounting as well as non-accounting organisations that are moving into this space. And the accounting is recognising, it's quite funny in a sense, because the accounting isn't necessarily pushing a numbers approach, and some of the other ones that are non-accounting are pushing a numbers approach. And so there's a range of options, right down to the bottom one, which is narratives, so simply case studies. And that's something that has been adopted, because organisations will say, let me tell you about one person's life we've changed. And that's great, and it's interesting, and it's very rewarding, but it doesn't give me a sense of, did they change one person's life this year, or did they change 100 people's lives? And what finances did they have to rely on that? What are the programs? What's the reach? So, there's this issue of no numbers without stories and no stories without numbers. And I agree there needs to be a balance of both. But I would say that numbers don't necessarily need to have dollar values attached. Telling me how many people you trained is just as important as trying to give me a dollar value for the happiness of those people. So we won't go through these in detail, but each of those reporting frameworks has limitations. And a lot of the limitations come back to, it's not an easy to understand process. The disclosure overload with a 500-page document, there's a lack of comparability, because with so much flexibility in the approaches, one organisation's report is going to look completely different to another organisation. And so three key things for me is disclosure overload, no clear structure, and understandability. And it's interesting that if I want to look at a company's financial performance, I pick up a one-page profit and loss. Now, absolutely, the annual report will have notes to the financial statements, and they are more than one page, but it starts with a one-page summary. But almost no organisation with a social purpose can give me a one-page summary. And I think that's a really important step forward for any organisation in this space. Just to say, based on your inputs and what were they, what were your outputs, and what were the outcomes? And if that could be succinctly communicated, I think that's really powerful. And if it can't be succinctly communicated, then my question is, why not? Because people have so much passion in this space and they put in a lot of effort. So I think there should also be some basic reporting that can be matched to that, because that will give them a lot more recognition, a lot more power, a wider appreciation of what's actually being achieved. And it's interesting that from the Finding Australia's Social Enterprise Survey, there was quotes from people, from organisations, social enterprises, who had different measurement approaches. And there's two quotes which I think perfectly sum things up. One says, we've actually worked with an accredited assessor of a particular impact measurement method. Excuse me. It says, the way in which social impact is measured, I couldn't explain it to you. I can only guess that social return on investment, because it is one of the popular approaches. It's very expensive. It's done by supposedly an expert. But if someone can't explain it to anyone else, what value does it really have? Because everything is so abstracted in terms of dollar values that you're losing integrity and you're losing a really important message. Another comment which perfectly contrasts that is the best way of actually explaining what a social enterprise can achieve is through storytelling. Okay, I don't disagree with storytelling, but I think if we've got to move beyond storytelling. I think you've got to tell me what inputs were there, what outputs, how many people have you helped, and what were the outcomes. We don't hear hospitals say, let me give you a fantastic story about a person who had an operation, here was the outcome. We can't just be informed about one patient. We need to be informed about the scale of operations. Okay, challenges of social reporting. So this, again, is a study done back in 2014, but I think this nicely captures the difference between, and social reporting is something faced by not-for-profits, by social enterprises, and by private sector organisations. So in the not-for-profit space, someone was saying, well, people are becoming more savvy about what they're investing in. Okay, they're wanting to see that as making a difference. And that's faced by all organisations with social aspects. And it's how you tell the story. I've no problem with the narrative, but that's not how it's displayed in the financial accounts. Okay, I agree with that. You can't just rely on the financial numbers. It's important to see, did they make a profit or loss overall? But you need a similar summary account of what's been achieved in social terms. How do you put a value on social return? What's valuable to me and what's valuable to you is very subjective. Again, I entirely agree with that. If we would not all come up with the same dollar value if we were going to, calculate the return of the value of happiness, for example. I actually spoke to someone who was giving lending, was a lending operation to social enterprise, and they had zero default on loans. And I said, wow, they're good numbers to advertise, and they were numbers that they hadn't advertised. In fact, there was no reporting or very minimal reporting. And the answer was, I agree, but it's a bit like the Qantas safety record. You just don't want to test fate, which is amusing but sad at the same time, that this is a sector who tends to be very quiet and yet wants attention for the right things from the right people. So I think reporting addresses that. If there's, concrete details of what's actually been done and what's been achieved, then I suspect support awareness will definitely increase, and with that, support would increase as well. And even from the private sector, the discussion there, so what's the value of our social contribution? It's a good question. Can you put a hard number on it? Probably not. And do you really need to? Probably not. And so again, I agree with these issues, and so they highlight just the challenges, particularly when you get to a numbers, and by me a dollar value basis, in terms of uncertainty, how to report, fear of exposure, and then just the measurement challenges. I'll just go very quickly over this, and it goes more to a theoretical space rather than a practical space. But we talk about legitimacy of organisations, and I think for not-for-profits and a little bit in the social enterprise, we focus on the moral legitimacy. So these are really important organisations because they're pursuing really important objectives, and that's true. But what we often don't hear in their reporting is, well, how are they doing that and what have they actually achieved? So the consequential legitimacy is often a gap in the reporting. And I think that's something that's really important to address, and it doesn't need rules. It just needs willingness of the organisations, because then we'll all get a better appreciation, not that they're just, they're good firms or good organisations to have, but they're also achieving really good things. And I think that's what we need an appreciation of. Coming from an accounting background, when we talk about accounting information, we talk about what's relevant, faithful representation. It's understandable, a one-page summary of the profit and loss. We only measure where it is reliable so that we can agree the measurement was appropriate. It seems that very few of these concepts, even though they're fundamental to accounting, very few have translated across to social reporting. And I think that's a real shame. I think that's a huge opportunity. And that's something that does need to be addressed and can be done in quite a simple way. So, for example, we'd all be familiar with an income statement where you have the income minus the expenses gives you net profit or loss. But a very simple summary could show what your inputs, what your outputs, and what your outcomes are for a social enterprise or for any organisation that has social objectives. And so Orange Sky Laundry, for example, is one of those organisations that offers a free mobile laundry service and now a free shower service to people who are homeless. And while it provides that service, it also engages in conversation with them and tries to link them with other services and just promotes inclusion. So they're very transparent and clear about what their profit or loss is, but they also, in quite simple terms, can tell you, inputs, what are their volunteer or how many volunteers and paid staff, what's their outputs in terms of the amount of laundry that's washed, but that conversation that's had, which are the two key indicators for them, and the outcomes, which are really important. And so I'd very much encourage anyone who is pursuing social objectives to think about communicating their performance in those terms. And you can see that none of the statement of social performance items have a dollar value. So I think, if you want to put a dollar value on them as a second step, that can be considered. But as a first step, just to provide some concrete details in terms of what's being achieved. So reflections, all businesses have social implications really, and we can see that from what Bowen was talking about back in the late 1940s. But there's a position of social enterprise we've seen is quite central in the business spectrum, and central in terms of fundamental as well as literally central. So there's a need for increased awareness, and I think through that will automatically come increased support and conscious consumerism. And one way of achieving this, I think, in a systematic approach is the social reporting. So the question I often ask is, what's the value of social reporting? And at the moment, I don't think it has a large value because I don't think it's being done well. But I think the potential value is huge. And so that's very much something I'm trying to push as an agenda when I speak with social enterprises, and just encourage them to promote that as a starting point for gaining awareness, gaining appreciation, and then support for their operations. So I'll leave it there. That's the main things to talk about, and more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Belinda. That was a really great presentation, and thanks everyone for attending. So if you have any questions, just type them into that question box there and I'll read them out so that Belinda can answer them. I'll give you a minute to type any questions that you might have. Oh, here we go. We've got one from Christy. Do you know of any social enterprises other than Salvos Legal in the legal space?
No, I don't. I haven't. I mean, social enterprises deal with goods and services, but no, I haven't come across any that operate in a legal space. And I guess a lot of the ones I speak to are very small scale, but no, not specifically for legal.
I think legal services might be a difficult area for social enterprise, since the people most in need of legal services often aren't able to pay a large amount.
And that's true. I guess it goes back to those three structures. Like if you had a commercial income stream from one different activity and then you applied it to supporting people. So when we talk about your customer base for a social enterprise, sometimes they're the customers who wouldn't necessarily be able to pay. So Orange Sky Laundry, for example, their service to people who are homeless is free, but then they have commercial contracts with other organisations. So there is a lot of that where your commercial revenue stream comes from one group and your social service goes to a different group. So it is completely possible, but it's just not that kind of organisation is not one I've dealt with previously.
We've got another question from James Farrell. He says, Belinda, could you share any stories about mission-driven organisations that have developed new social enterprises, the process they go through, and anything else?
Sure. Look, they're all so unique, and I guess you could say that of any organisation, but straight away when you've got these dual objectives of social and financial, it almost doubles the struggles or the challenges that you potentially face. And I think what's important is, getting buy-in from the top of an organisation to do that. So we spoke to one, for example, in Tasmania, and the social programs that they started were relatively small at the beginning, but they felt it was ambitious and they felt it was innovative and also a little bit risky, but they also felt they had full support from the top. And, those projects turned out to be very commercially viable, so profitable, which was great, and fantastic social projects. And they were achieving, there was a range of them, but one was training unemployed youth and then putting them back into the mainstream workplace. So, finding them long-term employment with others, because a lot of the times they don't want to be positioned as, the full-time long-term employer. They want to see themselves as a transition space so they can have a steady stream of bringing in new people. So that was one of the things that was really important, is that when you have support from the top and you have acceptance that maybe, it's not commercially viable in the short term, or that you've got confidence it's going to work in the long term, I think a lot of the pressures then, fall to the side, and what you get to focus on and where your energy goes, which is really great, is just in pursuing that social objective. And we found that organisations that do have that environment, they tend to find the commercial success earlier, in a sense, which is great. And of course, they're really passionate about what they're doing. But I think what's interesting is that is once you get, and it's often because we've seen this on with small enterprises, once you get local awareness, there's often local support very quickly for that. So it's interesting about, it's the profile that needs to be established and the awareness that needs to be established, because people will help in different ways, and it doesn't have to be financial. Of course it can be, but even if it's volunteering, if it's providing, I've got spare resources that might be useful for you. There's a lot of stories and a lot of cases where that has really helped organisations establish and then expand. So local support's important, and then it can extend beyond the local.
All right, thank you. That was a very detailed answer. And thanks for the great questions. It seems like nobody has any more questions, so thank you to the attendees, and thank you, Belinda.
No problem.